He should be focused on the fact that we had a shock that pushed inflation up and growth down. And that's a bad supply shock. That's a self-inflicted wound. And it tells us that policy is moving in the wrong direction. And it's a shot against the bow of the Trump tariff policies, which clearly have materially changed the picture in a way that the Fed is seeing both as more uncertain and more problematic on both their key objectives.
I was struck by the fact that in the projections, the growth projections were taken down, not just for 25, but 26 and 27 as well. On the inflation side, it was really mainly in 25, and you heard Chair Powell say maybe the effects are transitory, using that word we've heard before.
I would have thought the chairman would retire the word transitory. That is perhaps the most notoriously ill-chosen phrase of his excellent 7.5-year run as Fed chair. And so I was astonished to see him resurrect that concept. He might turn out to be right, particularly if the economy suffers a recession. It's conceivable that the economy won't suffer a recession and he'll turn out to be right. But it's certainly not something that I would want to bank on. There's another point that I think most observers have missed, which is if you look at the dot plot, the median, the person in the middle on interest rates, has not changed. That's what everybody's highlighted. But the average, if you just take an average of everybody's forecast, that's moved up a fair amount in the last few months, reflecting the fact that with these tariffs, with the inflation they're bringing, there's less confidence on the part of the Fed that they're going to be able to cut rates, even as there's a prediction of more cyclical weakness in the economy. So this is clearly a more worrying picture than we had in December, and there's only been one important change, and that's been the change in tariff policy and, more broadly, the political approach to economics.
One of the themes throughout what Chair Powell had to say was uncertainty, because there's the concern about what is being done. There's also the concern about what we don't know around the corner. We have an enormous uncertainty. What does that do to the economic machinery in and of itself?
Nothing good. Look, the task of policy is to reduce uncertainty. The task of policy is to give confidence about sustainability. When policymakers are confidently promising a stock market boom when they come in, and then they deliver the 11th fastest correction in the last century, one of the fastest corrections in the last century, and then they discover that they think the economy needs some kind of detox, and they don't give any indication of whether it's going to end, and they vow unprecedented levels of protection to be declared on a date in the future. That is introducing uncertainty, not reducing uncertainty, and I think that's really quite dangerous.
I am struck, Larry, that as we talk about what the Federal Open Market Committee did, we're talking about the White House almost exclusively. And talk about more broadly what we are seeing coming out of the White House, how it is could affect the economy. For example, this week, we had the president say, I'm going to dismiss 2 sitting FTC commissioners, even though they're an independent agency, concern that might extend into the Federal Reserve. What are the ramifications throughout the government and the economy of the actions we're seeing?
Let me speak very directly, David. We are not there yet. But every week for the last 2 months, the risk of an attempt to impose authoritarianism in the United States have gone up. The dismissals that you mentioned are one example. The lawless cutbacks of spending are another example. The impositions and threats to universities with no process, nothing of what is required in Title VI law is another example. The steps with respect to expelling people who are here without the process protections contained in law are another example. The assertion that if the president does it or to help the country or save the country, it can't be illegal is another example. The flirtation with fascists abroad, such as the AfD in Germany by the vice president, is yet another example, and there are many more. We have not crossed a Rubicon yet where court orders are being defied. That hasn't happened yet, but we are getting much closer to that Rubicon. The so-called Overton window of things that are seen as possible and imaginable has broadened. And ultimately, that is going to be alarming for what America is, and therefore potentially going to do grave damage to our economy and the world's. We are not there quite yet, but I have to say what was a possible concern 2 months ago now seems to me to be a genuinely alarming prospect. And that should disturb and worry every investor, and our country's leaders in the business and financial community who know how much they have depended on the rule of law should be organizing to resist what could be an extraordinarily damaging long-term change in policy. It takes decades to grow a forest and a few minutes to burn it down. Something like that is true with respect to our nation's credibility and commitment to rule of law. And so I do not remember in the last 50 years a more alarming moment in terms of the approach that the U.S. government is taking to our democratic institutions.